Hi, welcome back. Gonna start a completely new topic today. And the topic is oscillation in biology. So far we just spent weeks talking about equilibrium points. We know how to find equilibrium points. We know how to evaluate their stability. We saw examples. We saw bifurcations involving equilibrium points. But it's been equilibrium, equilibrium, equilibrium. And I want to take a step back for a second. And I want to ask not about the mathematical concept of equilibrium point in a vector field or a differential equation. I want to talk about the scientific concept of equilibrium and what role does it play in various sciences. So actually, as you take various classes and you learn various scientific topics, the concept of equilibrium comes up again and again and again as a sort of a master concept that dominates the dynamics of the subject. So for example, chemical equilibrium, we are told in freshman chemistry, page 1 of the chemistry text, you put a bunch of substances in a box and they go to equilibrium. If we study thermodynamics, you put a hot cup of coffee in a cold room, and that cup of coffee quickly comes to equilibrium with the room temperature. We talk a lot about ecological equilibrium, at least in the old days they did, where a population would rise to a carrying capacity and then stay at equilibrium there. That's ecological equilibrium. In economics, what happens early in the econ course is they tell you that where supply meets demand, there's an equilibrium point, and that is what free markets do. They quickly find an equilibrium price. So everywhere we go in science, we keep running into this concept of equilibrium as the dominant form of motion in that subject. And in physiology, it's also true. There is an equilibrium concept dominating in physiology. And that equilibrium concept has a fancy name. It's called homeostasis. And it's the idea that physiological quantities are maintained at equilibrium values. Now, I say maintained at equilibrium values. There is a mechanism. That word maintained is a causal, is an active word, and there is a mechanism that maintains that constant level. And that mechanism is exactly negative feedback loops of the kind that we have seen a bunch of. And the idea is, for example, I took this off the net, body temperature. As we all think we know, normal body temperature is 98.6. And if your body temperature goes up, let's say you exercise, so body temperature rises above normal, then the brain dilates the vessels to produce better radiation of heat, get it out of the core and out into the periphery where it radiates. And that way body heat is lost to the surroundings and body temperature drops towards normal and is maintained. And conversely, if you get a little cold, then the hypothalamus senses that and vasoconstricts peripherally to retain the blood in the trunk where it will not be dissipated into the environment. So this is a beautiful idea. This is taught in physiology classes. Everyone knows that normal body temperature is 98.6, and here is the negative feedback mechanism maintaining the constant body temperature of 98.6. Let's talk about hormones, for example, insulin and glucose. So when your glucose rises, for example, as a result of eating a meal, you now have high glucose levels, and those high glucose levels cause the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin then combines with glucose in the muscle cell and facilitates the metabolism of the glucose. Conversely, if your blood glucose gets a little low, then the pancreas secretes a different hormone called glucagon, and that raises glucose levels. So once again, constant insulin glucose levels maintained that way by the mechanism of negative feedback loops. More hormone. Let's talk about other organs, the thyroid, the gonads. They all release hormones, and those hormones, the level of those hormones is sensed by the brain, and the brain has a negative feedback mechanism in it, which then, if the hormone gets too high, sends a signal to shut down production, and if the hormone is too low, sends a signal to increase production. So there we go again. Equilibrium levels of important quantities, physiologically important quantities, are maintained at a steady state level by negative feedback loops. Now, that's the scientific concept of equilibrium. And that's equivalent, and I'm putting them side by side now, that's equivalent to the mathematical concept of not just an equilibrium point, but a stable equilibrium point. The equilibrium point because it's constant, and the stable equilibrium point is precisely what is created by the negative feedback. If you perturb the system off, if you push the system off the equilibrium point, it returns to the equilibrium point, which makes it a stable equilibrium point, due to the negative feedback. And those stable equilibrium points are exactly the stable equilibrium points that we have studied all along. So that's just a beautiful concept. But now I have to ask a question. Is this beautiful concept right? Are these equilibrium theories good science? Which amounts to asking, are all of these natural processes, chemistry, economics, physiology, are those subjects really governed by equilibrium dynamics? The answer is no. So let's start with the one fact of physiology that everybody thinks they know. Normal body temperature is 98.6. And of course, that's maintained by that negative feedback mechanism of the hypothalamus, which we already discussed. So that's very beautiful. Normal body temperature is constant at 98.6, except when you look at the data. The data do not support that statement. This is a very pretty paper that was in Science, as you see, 40, 50 years ago, where they looked at student volunteers. They had core body temperature measured here over 4 days with an indwelling catheter to measure body temperature. Don't ask questions about that. It's delicate. But they did get a continuous record of body temperature, and this is what it looks like. And now the interesting thing is you say, well, it's only going up and down because the light-dark cycle is going up and down external to the body. And so these folks did the obvious experiment, which was they took volunteers and they put them in the bottom of a salt mine and said, here's a nicely furnished apartment at the bottom of a salt mine. You're going to live in continuous darkness. And they again measured body temperature. And what you see here is very, very different from the idea of constant body temperature. Number one, it's an oscillation. If you look at the peak to trough distance, the magnitude of that oscillation is 1 degree centigrade. So that's a substantial oscillation. And it's not a good idea to say, well, it's sort of kind of constant, but there's some fluctuations. That's not true. This is a very systematic phenomenon. Notice the waveform, the way temperature rises during the daytime. The gray areas are sleep and darkness for the people who had darkness. Notice that the way that it rises is characteristic of all of these subjects, and then just before evening, it starts to fall, and it falls all night, and that's reproducible in all of the subjects. This is an oscillatory phenomenon. Core body temperature is not constant. It oscillates. And we need to not deny that fact. We need to look at that fact and accept that fact and revise our concept of homeostasis, at the very least, the part of it that is stasis. This system is not a system that's describable by the word stasis. Let's talk about hormones. Hormones are maintained at a constant level by feedback from the brain. And I have seen the slides in some introductory physiology courses on various campuses, of which this is a version. And you are told that hormones are maintained at constant levels. Let's look at the data. Here's estradiol, principal female sex hormone. Here's estradiol over 24 hours in a healthy 27-year-old female. Is that being maintained at a constant level? No, it isn't. You'll notice that there not only are there oscillations, there are oscillations at several different time scales. First of all, there's a 12-hour oscillation between day and night. Big oscillations in the daytime, small oscillations at night. The second thing you see is that during the daytime, there are clear oscillations with about a 2-hour period, and that these occur very regularly during the daytime and less so at night. So once again, you look at this picture and ask yourself, does the word homeostasis fit this picture? And the answer is, well, the stasis part has got to be wrong, because these are not being maintained at anything like steady state levels. Let's go to another example. Insulin glucose. Very nice paper from the group at the University of Chicago, Pritzker Medical School. Looked at insulin glucose, and they saw oscillations in insulin and glucose. And the obvious objection is, well, of course there's oscillations in insulin glucose. You eat 3 meals a day, and that's perturbing the system 3 times a day. You're going to see oscillations from the meals. So they had the smart idea of eliminating meals. And they got volunteers to take their nutrition continuously through an IV glucose drip and measured insulin and glucose in those subjects. Here's an example. During 20 hours here, with no meals, no perturbations, constant IV glucose. So that ought to produce a constant output, but it most certainly does not. Insulin and glucose both oscillate. You will notice that the peaks pretty much align. There's a coherence here between the insulin oscillations and the glucose oscillations. You will also notice that the glucose peaks slightly lead the insulin peaks. And of course, that makes sense because the glucose is increasing the production of insulin. The glucose is activating insulin in the pancreas. And so it makes sense that the glucose leads the insulin because, as you'll see, a very important fact, there's a time delay in the production of insulin by the pancreas when it receives the glucose. It can't just start putting out insulin instantaneously. So insulin and glucose oscillate, and the glucose leads the insulin. Okay, let's take an even more extreme example, chemical equilibrium. Now, am I really going to question the doctrine of chemical equilibrium? Well, the answer is yes. In the 1950s, a Russian chemist named Belousov was studying the reduction of bromate by malonic acid and something like that. And he noticed that the chemicals in his beaker were oscillating in concentration. And here is a record of that. This is one of the ions, the bromate ion, and is going up and down, as well as all of the other intermediates in the reaction. And Belousov said, well, my goodness, this is an oscillatory chemical reaction. So he wrote it up in Russian, and he sent it to the big Russian chemistry journal, and they were not amused. They rejected it. He got a little knock on the door. This was the age of Stalin. He got a little knock on the door and was told, don't send in this junk anymore. This is impossible. This violates the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything goes to equilibrium. So he didn't speak English, but he found a friend who did speak English, Jabotinsky. And they rewrote the paper in English, and they sent it to Nature, the #1 science journal. And Nature rejected it, and the editor enclosed the rejection letter from the reviewer, and the rejection letter to the editor said, we really must develop a form letter to send to people who think they have invented a perpetual motion machine. In other words, once again, there was this argument that thermodynamics implies that you cannot have an oscillatory chemical reaction. This is a misunderstanding and a misapplication of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics says, if you actually go back and look at the second law, there's an assumption that you are in a closed system. It is in a closed system that all processes increase entropy and go to the equilibrium of maximum entropy. Only in a closed system. Give me an example of a closed system. Is the nucleus a closed system? No, it is not. It receives molecules from outside and it puts out molecules to the outside. Is the cell a closed system? No, it is not. It receives energy molecules, it puts out waste molecules. Is the organ a closed system? No, it is not. Is the person a closed system? No, it is not. Is society a closed system? No, it is not. Is the earth a closed system? No, it is not. It receives heat energy from the sun. So it turns out there aren't any closed systems. This is not a closed system. It receives energy from outside. Ultimately, way, way, way down the line here, this reaction will die because the catalysts get poisoned. And in the long, long, long run, this oscillation will cease and the chemical reaction will indeed go to equilibrium. But that's a long time from now. And it's a bad scientific idea to describe this process by saying, in the long run, it goes to equilibrium. As the economist Keynes said about economics, in the long run, we're all dead. So it's a bad idea to describe this as saying this is an equilibrium process. And we better pay attention to these oscillations because they're very real and we need to think about how they happen and what they are doing there. Let's talk about ecological equilibrium. Well, you know the story about the carrying capacity and the population rises to the carrying capacity until it goes to equilibrium there. But you also remember from a while back population oscillations. Here is a predator-prey. The hare, which is a rabbit, is the prey. The lynx is what we call a bobcat, is also oscillating. You will notice that, as in all predator-prey oscillations, the prey peak leads the predator peak because the prey increase the predator. And they increase the predator by supplying food to the predator, which then goes through a gestation period and increases its population. So these are ecological oscillations. Now there's an example, a very important example, of ecological oscillations in physiology. What am I talking about? There's a lot of attention being paid, and rightly so, to this concept of the microbiome. So the microbiome are populations of bacteria in your gut, oral cavity, in the vaginal cavity. There are huge populations of bacteria in the normal human. And Elaine Hsiao points out that only 10%, if you look at a person, only 10% of the cells in this box belong to me. 90% of the cells in this box are bacteria in my various repositories. Now, and imbalance and dynamics of these bacterial populations are being shown to be essential in mental illness, in epilepsy, certainly in weight control, in depression, in lots of different things that you would not believe that gut bacteria could possibly affect, but they do. And so people have begun to look at population dynamics of these bacterial species in the gut. This is a very pretty paper on bacterial species in the oral cavity. And as you see, there's a 24-hour oscillation in the populations of various strains of this kind of bacterium or that kind of bacterium. And so these are microbiome population dynamics oscillations going on inside you. Now, how are we going to understand these oscillations? We've seen a bunch of them. We would like to have an understanding of how they work. And you may remember the oscillations in the shark tuna model. And you say, well, there's a model for how oscillations would work. Notice that the shark tuna model is itself a negative feedback model. The tuna give rise positively to the shark population by feeding them through predation, but the shark population then reduces the tuna population by eating them. So shark tuna is also a negative feedback relationship. And so that's an interesting candidate. But remember a problem that we had with the shark tuna model. This is a typical trajectory of the shark tuna model. And if we changed the initial condition, we changed it from this initial condition to this initial condition, the oscillation changed. In other words, for example, if you were going around this loop and you perturbed it to this point with an intervention, the effect of that intervention would last forever. You would be on this new trajectory and you'd be going around and around this loop forever. That's not a good model for physiological oscillation. If this was body temperature and it was oscillating and you had a fever that moved you to a higher temperature, you don't want to stay at that higher temperature forever. You want to be able to go back to the baseline oscillation. So now I'm invoking a concept, a kind of a new concept, which is that we want to combine. We have this concept of oscillation, which we like, which we need, but the concept of oscillation, the shark tuna model is not a good example of what we want. What we want is an oscillation that is stable. That is an oscillation, let's say it looks like this, and it's going to have the property that if you start inside, if you perturb the system to the inside, it's going to return to the oscillation. And if you start the system outside, it's going to return to the oscillation. So the idea of stable oscillation is what we're going for, and we don't yet really have a concept of it or how to talk about it.